packed audience. I hear they're still filling up the Madrona room, so we'll probably have 250 people here. For a highly relevant subject. This is Orcas Currents, which began as a lecture series on science, technology, and culture. And in a way, we've tried to shy away from politics because it can be so controversial, but as I said when Hedrick talked here last November, when democracy is at risk, we can't afford to be so cavalier. And one of the building blocks, one of the foundation stones of a democracy is a healthy and vigorous press, which is coming under increasing attack of late. So I think that is a very relevant subject for Orcas Currents to be addressing. Let me read. Very recently, Frank Bruni, one of the columnists I follow in the New York Times, had a statement I'd like to read to you. What happens to a democracy whose citizens not only lose common ground, but also take a match to the idea of a common reality? All right, so, and that's what's happening. That's what I see happening with fake news and, tweets and alternative facts. The grounds between reality and imagination are shifting. So let me introduce our speakers who can come up as I introduce them. I could say that Hedrick Smith needs no introduction here, but let me just mention he's the winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one of them an unshared Pulitzer for his book, The Russians, which makes him a real expert on what's going on today. His most recent book, Who Stole the American Dream, is very relevant to the discussions we're going to have here. That hit the New York Times bestseller list for a few weeks, if I recall. He was the Moscow and Washington bureau chief for the New York Times back in the 1970s. And he left print and went into producing video for the public broadcasting system, particularly its Frontline series, and won 2 Emmy Awards. So if you know of anyone else who has 2 Pulitzers and 2 Emmys, let me know. We'd like to have him here. Sarah Stillman will be in conversation with her. The daughter of island residents, now permanent residents, Don Stillman and Judy Cox sitting in the front row. And at 32, at the tender age of 32, she's been for 4 years a staff writer at The New Yorker, doing long-form articles on social justice. But it doesn't stop there. She teaches journalism at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, as well as literary nonfiction at Yale University. She's also a winner of the National Magazine Award for her work, among other awards, and is a MacArthur Fellow starting in 2016. Come on up. And then to narrate it, Floyd McKay. I first heard about Floyd McKay in connection with the coal terminal and more broadly fossil fuel transport in the Pacific Northwest. He did this, by far the best coverage for Crosscut. But 3 decades, he spent 3 decades as a reporter in Oregon for, I think among others, the Oregonian. He was chair of the journalism department at Western Washington University starting in the 1990s for 8 years. He's a Neiman Fellow at Harvard University and won the DuPont Columbia Broadcast Award, one of the most prestigious awards in broadcasting. He'll be the moderator today. And with that, I'm going to leave it all to the 3 of them.
Let me just say, to kick this off, how pleased I am that, and we are, that Michael and the Orcas Currents Committee asked us to come talk about journalism and the future of journalism in America. And I'm very pleased to be on the stage with Sarah, who's already established at a very early age a distinguished career, and with Floyd, who like me has been around the block and knows a story or 2 and a trick or 2. But I also want to thank you all for coming. It's fun to see a lot of friends, but it's more important to recognize that you are here because you value good journalism and that's why you're here. It's a critical moment for journalism in this country. It's a critical time we're passing through. We all understand that our democracy is in trouble, and we do understand, if we've got any sense, that among the guardrails of democracy, such as the rule of law and the courts, journalism figures high. If we're not going to drive off a cliff on this crazy highway we're on right now, journalism is going to be one of the important guardrails that's going to keep us here. Journalism is under assault from a number of different directions. We have to deal with and figure out how to cope with fake news. We have the impact of the 24/7 news cycle, which has caused people to consume journalism the way they do potato chips or peanuts in a bar. In a hurry, enjoy it, forget it, right? We're under tremendous economic pressure. The pressures of the new media, particularly the internet, on traditional journalistic organizations, newspapers, networks, is terrible. The number of really good reporters and good editors, good producers who've been laid off, and the burden that is placed on the remaining staff is enormously heavy. And it has a real thinned out, it has had a thinning out effect on our journalism. So we have a bond in this, you and we. We're producers. Actually, now I'm a consumer a lot myself. But we're producers and you're consumers. And the quality of journalism that we get in this country depends on both of us, not just us. But it depends on you, the audience, too. You have to both demand quality journalism, aggressive, independent, enterprising, probing, never satisfied with the story we've got. And you have to support it. We now have a generation or two that thinks news is for free. It costs several $1 million for the New York Times or the Washington Post to have 3 or 4 or 5 investigative reporters trying to follow the finances of the president or the relationship between the Trump campaign and the Russians and so forth. That's very expensive news. And when you look at the quality of news that you're getting now, what's really interesting is the pressures of fake news, of alternative facts, of attacks on the media by the politicians, which, by the way, aren't new. I can take you right back to John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon. I hope we'll get into that at some point here. All those things have put pressure on journalism, and I think today you're actually seeing better quality journalism in America than you saw a year or two ago. The press was asleep at the beginning of the 2016 campaign. They thought it was entertainment media. They thought it was the latest version of The Apprentice Show. But that's not what the press thinks today. If you look at the quality of news and you look at the kinds of information that are in the press today, I think the press has been re-energized by the challenge of all these threats. But it's also been re-energized because many of you are more interested. Many of you are signing up. Circulation at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, they're going up. There are more people paying attention. There are more people who want to know what happened today, and they want to know not just what happened today, but what really happened behind what happened today. So we have a bond here. So as we talk tonight, I hope you'll be thinking not just about what we can do, but about what you can do and how we can do interactively. It's really important. We are guardrails. Our democracy is in trouble, and we need to keep connected, you and we.
Thank you. I'm feeling fired up already just by those remarks, and it's so wonderful to see such a big audience, and I feel in some ways this is very much a homecoming for me. I've sort of grown up in some respects on Orcas Island and have written many articles in the Orcas Island Public Library, so I'm so grateful. I feel like I'm with my family in this moment, and also feel like we're in this as a family as well, thinking about these vast, giant, urgent questions about how substantive news gets produced and how fake news gets combated. Because I must admit that I try to think as little as possible and to know as little as possible about fake news, because I think one of the things that the current administration is tremendously good at is distracting us so that we don't end up actually focusing on the real stories that are truly impacting people. So I hope we'll get to hear some of your thoughts on that tonight and talk through some of our own experiences actually as practitioners of investigative journalism. I share some of Rick's optimism about it. in the sense that I actually entered journalism in 2007, 2008, at the very moment of the financial crisis. And so that was a moment many of you may remember was also incredibly apocalyptic in terms of how people were talking about the future of the media. And everyone was saying, first of all, like, no one is going to read long-form, deep dive investigative journalism. We're all shifting over, as we make this move from print to digital, we're shifting over to the quick hit. You know, people are willing to stay with you for 3 or 4 seconds, but they're never going to stay with you for 10,000 words. And so it's really heartening to think, I got into the field right at the moment everyone told me I was doing an absolutely crazy thing, both economically and in all other ways. And to see that today, that hypothesis has been proven entirely wrong. I mean, we've seen the appetite for long-form deep dive journalism to be tremendous, and people really, really want substance in the news that they're consuming. And so I feel like that alone has been heartening. And then disheartening has been how little, I think many people appreciate the amount of resources that go into investigative work. So, you know, I think about some of the first stories I did for The New Yorker were from Iraq and Afghanistan. I was actually a freelancer when I went over there, and I had to buy body armor on my own on bodyarmor.com, where they were selling used body armor, and I was getting paid literally, I think for a lot of my first freelance pieces, I was getting paid $50 or $100 for pieces that I spent more money on my plane ticket to get over there. And so I think one of the things that's taught me being at a place like The New Yorker is watching all of the colleagues and all of the resources that get marshaled. It's not just each of us individual journalists alone, but also a team working with tremendously brilliant and committed fact checkers and editors, and this whole group of people who band together to create the kind of products that there's deep appetite for, but not a clear business model for how we're going to sustain paying for it. So I hope that that's one of the things we can talk about tonight. And Floyd, it's wonderful to be with you as a moderator. And I admire both of your work so much. So I hope we can tackle, again, some of the big questions about how we're going to sustain producing this work. And also, again, how we're going to combat the Trump effect of consistently having our minds distracted by each new hourly news cycle that's creating some crisis that I tend to believe is partly about the magic trick of getting us to focus over here while critical resources are being deprived of people who urgently need them over there. And so maybe we can steer some of the conversation towards those big, meaty topics that I know you've both done a lot of reporting on.
Thank you both Rick and Sarah. And as you can see, we're not going to be short of ideas this evening. We are really privileged to have two highly qualified journalists who are from different generations, different experience, and different outlooks. Part of my job here is just going to be to try to keep the ball in the air, and please bounce in on each other. Don't wait for me, and if you start talking too long, I'll get on you. Okay? There's been an advent of new technologies in journalism and in politics and in propaganda in recent years, and it's ushered in an era that our forum tonight refers to as post-truth environment. It's kind of a new term, but we live in that world. And we hear frequently the term fake news. We've always had slant or bias, and we've always had political manipulation, but this seems to be something new and different. And Rick, I wonder if you would tell us what is fake news and why is it particularly insidious?
Well, I have to say, I have a problem with the term fake news, just for starters. News isn't fake, news is real. But that's the difference. Fake news, we need to be pretty clear about it. It is fabricated. It is whole cloth fabricated. It is not just news you don't like. If the president gets on the Twitter and tweets that CNN or the New York Times or Washington Post is doing fake news, he's talking about news he doesn't like, news that's critical of him. But it's not fake news. Whether or not it's got facts right or wrong in it, it's not fake news. It's not made up. We entered a new era in the campaign of 2016, really. The Russians had literally 1,000 fake news sites. They were set up all over Europe and somewhat in Asia. They literally were pumping out entirely fabricated news. You may remember one of the stories was that Hillary Clinton was running a human trafficking operation out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And it was believed by some guy in Georgia who came up with an AR-15 and shot up the pizza parlor, which is a very popular pizza parlor on Wisconsin Avenue, not too far from where Susan, my wife, and I used to live. So, I mean, this was an entirely made-up story. There wasn't any grain of truth in it. It wasn't like there was a kernel of truth, and they just got it wrong a bit, and it was really the place down the street, or it wasn't quite human trafficking. You know, it was an entirely made-up story. There was recently an episode where 20th Century Fox News produced a brand new movie, which they wanted to publicize, and they created half a dozen fake news sites pretending to be newspapers in various cities in America, in Sacramento and Dallas and in other places. In Sacramento, the real paper is the Bee. They created a paper called the Sacramento Tribune. In Dallas, it's the Dallas Morning News. They created the Dallas Times. And they literally populated these 6 sites with phony stories in order to seed the site with propaganda and promotional material about the movie. So they wanted the fake news to attract people to come there. The entire thing was fabricated, made up. They got caught at it eventually. One of the items they had on one of their sites was that Trump and Putin had met on the French Riviera. That got picked up and it got relayed hundreds of thousands of times around the world. So there were lots of people who were predisposed to believe the stories that were on these sites. And that's what makes fake news work. And that is, it plays to people's prejudices, and then it gets repeated. So that is entirely fabricated news. It's a new phenomenon that we really need to deal with by simply reporting straight news all the time as much as we can and exposing fake news for what it is and people recognizing this is bogus. If it sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, it probably is. Forget it. Move on.
Sarah, what are the people that you work with in Columbia Journalism School and other places where you see a lot of young people? What do they think about this? Is it a new phenomena? Do they have a different take on it because they're so much more technology oriented?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the critical things is it would be wonderful if we could solve this just through our own sheer volition and the will to actually commit to reading substantive news. But this is fundamentally a technology problem as much as any other kind of problem, because fundamentally what you're seeing is that readers, young readers especially, are reading their news on their phone, not through the actual news sites themselves most of the time. They're now reading directly through the platform. So you're probably familiar with like reading on Facebook, reading on Snapchat, reading directly through platforms that are now the arbiters of what news gets seen. And the regulators of what news gets seen are these algorithms that are almost entirely secret in ways that Silicon Valley has mostly defended up until now as, you know, a function of the kind of libertarian ethos that we shouldn't be trying to editorialize and try to control what people see. We should just, they're basically pretending we're just letting people see, you know, whatever gets the most clicks and whatever is generated by users. But in reality, one of the things that that algorithm has done is tilted itself towards clickbait. And so these fake news factories that are in, you know, Macedonia producing articles about how Hillary Clinton is running a sex trafficking ring in a pizza shop, you know, they're the kinds of stories that a lot of people click on and then get seen more and more and more through this kind of wildfire that spreads on platforms like Facebook. So I think an integral part of this conversation and changing this dynamic is inevitably going to have to be engaging Silicon Valley in a conversation about a very complicated conversation, because some people's fake news is other people's free speech, and how do you actually regulate that?
I think one of the really important differences was, at least during the period where major newspapers and the 3 television networks were dominating the news business, and we're going back 25 years or something like that, is that we all had some kind of standard. They had to have 2 sources to back a story. You didn't run a story without that. You didn't run rumors and that kind of stuff. And there was some kind of judgment, some kind of standard. That began to break down with tabloid journalism. That's the kind of tabloids that you could pick up in the supermarket. And now we've got to the point here where you do have these major social media platforms, Facebook being primary, but lots of others as well, where there literally is no judgment being made. There's no editorial standard. There's nobody monitoring it all. And a lot of the people who are the customers and users don't differentiate between news organizations that are trying to exercise some kind of editorial control, some kind of judgment about whether or not there are fact and evidence behind the news, and people who say just what Sarah just said, this is free speech, people can say anything they want. Well, you remember Pat Moynihan said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. So we have to get back to that notion of facts.
Does the term news media mean anything anymore? You know, we used to call it the press, and everyone understood what the press was. And then television news became part of the press, but now it is huge. It goes from Twitter with 142 characters or whatever it is, over to publications like The New Yorker and documents like Rick has done. Is this a word that doesn't mean anything to people anymore?
Well, I think the word media is as broad as you say. I think the minute you put the word news in front of it, then it seems to me it needs to narrow. People need to make that judgment. If I'm going on Facebook, if I'm going on Snapchat, if I'm going on someplace on the internet, and I'm just swapping opinions with people, and I have to say I have 3 Facebook pages, and I have to say I don't do much editing, but there's some stuff that's scatological and that's insulting, and I just eliminate it from my page when I see it. You know, so people literally have to monitor themselves or monitor their pages and say, you know, that's beyond the pale. Do you have the right of free speech? Yes, you have the right. But if you literally read some of the insulting comments that people post on Facebook towards politicians, towards somebody else who's just taken the opposite position, whatever it is, this is not enlightened engagement, refining arguments and getting closer to the truth. I think at that point we have to say, this isn't news, this is media, fine, go be entertained, but we're over here trying to produce something serious.
I will chime in, though, to say that in some ways, we're talking about this mostly in a pejorative sense of all the terrible things that have happened as a result of media being opened up to all these people who may not belong to tested media organizations. There's also a really wonderful side of that, and I would argue we're seeing the tremendous democratization of news making, and I think one positive thing that has lent us is actually a lot of people who are able to see things that trouble them in their own communities and put it out there to the world and insist that it not be ignored by mainstream sources. So we talked yesterday about the Black Lives Matter movement and people insisting, actually it matters to me that a black person was killed in front of me and his body is lying in the street, and you cannot tell me that that's not news, and I will continue to tweet at you until you cover it. I think we saw that in Flint, Michigan. I think we're seeing this really interesting set of models of people who are not conventional sort of trusted source journalists, but who are coming from places like the ACLU, who actually funded an investigative reporter to look into local community complaints. Actually, I think it began as complaints about the emergency manager, just the very construct of that being anti-democratic, and then it led to that investigative journalists finding a lot of local people who were sharing their stories, in some cases on Twitter, actually tweeting out pictures of gross bottles of water that were coming from their tap that were brown, and insisting that those stories be heard as well. So I do think it's important to balance, on the one hand, this really negative repercussions of that democratization, but also the really flowering of democracy.
You use the example of Twitter, and Twitter kind of fascinates me as a platform. The fact that these things were carried on Twitter doesn't make Twitter a news medium. But how do people differ between that? They picked up something there that was news, and it was genuine news. It wasn't fake news. But what about the rest of the stuff on Twitter? How do we filter through? How do we help people who may not be sophisticated in the area of news or technology filter through this? What do we do about that?
Well, I think that's where your professional news organizations come in. In fact, if it's news, in fact, if the Flint story about the brown water, or if you take Egypt, all the demonstrations to Tahrir Square, a lot of those got into the news media via Facebook, certainly. A lot of the news we've gotten out of Syria has come through Facebook and posted, social media posted photographs and reports. What happens is that professional media, when they spot real news, they move in and they pick it up. It gets disseminated. And so, I mean, it's sorting wheat from chaff. I mean, that's part of when you're going to a doctor, you're paying for expertise. When you're going to a really good plumber, you're paying for somebody who knows something about what's going on inside the pipes. When you go to an expert car mechanic, you're doing the same thing. When you're going to the news media, you're doing the same thing. You're looking for somebody who knows something about how you gather and judge what's news and what's real, what's not, what's a news break, what's adding to information, what sources are potentially trustworthy, which ones aren't. Listen, we had an entire national government and a certain part of the news media that got terribly misled by a bunch of Iraqi emigres who managed to float the idea that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They got the Pentagon to believe it, and they got, unfortunately for a while, the New York Times to believe it and other media, and they were dead wrong. And these were people who were in the business of marketing a false story for the sake of trying to generate American military intervention in their country. And it's the job of professionals to sort that out. I don't know that you can expect every individual to be able to do that. The more we're talking about this, the better chance we have that people are going to stop and say, I don't know. But what we tend to do is say, did you hear this? And then you pass it on. And when you say, did you hear this on Twitter or on Facebook, it doesn't just go to your neighbor. It goes to several 100,000 people, and then it goes global. It goes, it goes throughout the virtual world. So I think hesitating from that tendency, just cautioning people is worthwhile. But I don't know how you get 6 billion people in the world to do all that editing job themselves. I think it happens.
Talk a little bit about fact-checking in quality publications. You work for New Yorker, which has a legendary fact-checking process. What should people expect from professional journalism organizations in terms of checking facts?
Well, this is one of the greatest gifts of working at a place like the New Yorker. I have the luxury of a full-time fact checker who's sometimes on a large investigative story of mine for literally a month. They go through every detail and they re-report it, which can be exasperating, but is mostly just incredibly wonderful. But I'll give you an example. I was reporting a story on young people who were used as confidential informants in the war on drugs, and people who were found with even just a tiny bit of pot on them, who were then told, you're going to go to prison for a really long time, or you can go do this incredibly dangerous drug sting on our behalf and risk your life, and then we'll let you off. And I wrote about a young woman who had gone and done that and ultimately ended up being killed. And in the course of the story, I wrote about how she sat down on her tan suede couch and thought about whether to do this sting or not. And my fact checker came back and said, actually, it wasn't a suede couch, it was a microfiber that resembled suede. I did the research. So, you can imagine, that's the level we're talking about here, and it's a wonderful gift, but I also, again, have the luxury of time. So part of what's really difficult about the Trump administration is that stories are changing in a matter of hours or minutes even, and so how do we keep pace with that? We're under tremendous, tremendous pressure, and I so deeply admire the folks at the Times and at the Post who are in this battle right now where they have to quickly and accurately turn around complicated news. I don't know how they do that.
We're dealing with an administration that admittedly lies, and then when they're got caught in fact-checking, they don't correct it. How much of a factor is this and are either of you concerned that this tactic, which the president has used and others have used in his behalf, becomes kind of the new norm? We're told by two very solid fact-checking organizations that in the first 6 months of the presidency, over 400 lies that they had checked were told by the president. How can others resist going along with this, and does this become new norm?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. And the story I immediately think of is Donald Trump Jr. and the meeting with the Russian attorney, okay? So the New York Times gets this story, and I presume I don't know, but I presume it got leaked to them from somebody within the intelligence committee, okay? So they get this story, and they go to Trump, and basically he says, it didn't happen, or it was a nothing meeting, or so forth. And so they wind up by running a story and with his sort of denial. And then they go back to him, and there's 2 or 3 days when his story changes, and then eventually it turns out then they read to him what somebody has read to them, which are the emails he got from his friend Ron Goldstein, who told him that this was a Russian government agent and they had some dirt on Hillary Clinton. And what happened in that story was really interesting. You not only got the story, but over 3 or 4 days, you got the backtracking. So you got 2 stories. You got the story what actually happened, but you got the story that allowed you to ask the question you just asked me, which is, how do we deal with an administration that lies like this? Well, you said that with absolute confidence. The only reason you could say that with absolute confidence is people have tracked it. People tracked Michael Flynn on how he didn't admit to Mike Pence about meeting with the Russian ambassador, and we went through that. So the way we deal with it is basically by really hard digging journalism. And when you start to see that, then people get that understanding, and after a while, you don't have to go back and necessarily go through every single episode. You've now established a pattern, and you can see it. I don't see any shortcut to dealing with this. And the lesson has got to be, I don't think we know whether or not whatever the Trump tactic is going to be popular and passed on to others until we know what the popular verdict is in the midterm elections of 2018 and in the next presidential election. If a bunch of politicians think this is a smart maneuver, they're going to try it. But if they watch and say, well, this guy's getting tripped up by his own tactics, this isn't working, it's not going to be attractive, and I don't think it's going to go on. And the same thing is going to be true for people who are running for governor in Ohio and South Carolina and Oklahoma, running for the Senate. I mean, when somebody gets away with something, I mean, the classic example was, and I hate to pick anything that's partisan because I really kind of want to make these comments nonpartisan, but when Walter Mondale was running against Ronald Reagan in 1984, and in one of their debates, he was asked, are you going to raise taxes? And Mondale said, yes, I'm going to raise taxes in order to deliver the social programs we need, and in order to balance the budget or come close to balancing the budget, I'm going to raise taxes. And I'm going to tell you I'm going to do it, and he's going to not tell you he's going to do it. And he was absolutely right. Reagan said, no, I'm not going to raise taxes. In fact, Reagan went back in, and Reagan raised taxes several times. So what politicians learned from that is it worked. Reagan got away with it. So politicians are now going and telling Americans all over the country, we're not going to raise taxes, whether they are or not. And until we get smart enough to see through that as a people, politicians are going to lie to us. As long as Twitter works for Trump, politicians will do it. If it doesn't work for Trump, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, and another thing, I think about the story of the emperor has no clothes, and how that whole story is predicated on the idea that the emperor would feel embarrassed if we exposed that he had no clothes on, which I kind of feel like the Trump era is an era in which the shamelessness of a guy just being completely comfortable walking around naked is sort of the story that we're reckoning with here. And to me, part of the way you combat that is also, of course, you have to, follow one of the tweets that says, something as substantive as the idea that transgender people cannot serve in the military. But there is a point when we also just have to insist, I'm sorry, we're going to allocate a lot of resources right now to also focusing on, what's happening at the state and local level when it comes to criminal justice reform, or what's happening on all these things that I fear are getting almost no coverage in the midst of these constant scandals. So I think in some ways the companion to what you said, which I believe in so wholeheartedly, which is we have to hold his feet to the fire and we have to track the lying and we have to be rigorous about that. Simultaneously, we also have to insist on continuing to report out and actually care about the things that are happening under the radar and also happening at a more state and local level.
That's an extremely good point, because if you look at any major newspaper or television, you see a huge amount of reporting on the White House, often coming out of Twitter and this sort of thing, and Congress is doing other things, and other things are being done in the administration, and it doesn't show up. What's happening?
But in fairness, I really think, Floyd, that's changing. In the first place, I don't know whether or not you breathe a sigh of relief, but we've had a few sighs of relief in our household in the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's been absolutely no Trump news on the front page of the New York Times on several days. So there is a judgment that's taken place. I mean, today there was a story on the front page of the New York Times, 2 stories that were interesting. One was that 50% of the job applicants for manufacturing jobs out in the middle of the country could not qualify, they couldn't pass a drug test. Oh, that's a different version of why the economy is not growing, isn't it? And then there was another story on the front page that said a hospital that had decided to contract out its emergency room services to a private company suddenly discovered that the billing skyrocketed. Now, those are stories that are about what's happening in America and to the American economy. And there are more and more of those now in print. During the whole healthcare debate, I was really impressed. We happened to listen to NPR in the morning as we were getting dressed and doing our exercises and so forth. And while there was the debate going on in the Senate, NPR was going to Kentucky and to West Virginia and to Oklahoma and around the country asking people what would happen to them if the Medicaid program were chopped in the way that these bills suggested. So they were balancing the reporting that was going on about the rather sensational news in Washington, where not a lot was happening. There was a lot of verbiage, but not a lot. And they were actually going on and dealing with it. So I think, I'm prepared to give the media that's working on this seriously more credit. Certainly the New Yorker is part of it. That's what I'm talking about. If people are demanding and seeking and supporting that kind of reporting, they're going to get it. And we're finally going to get eventually to the issues we need to get to.
One of the problems with this is great, and I think I see it also going about, and this audience will read that, and this audience will listen to NPR and watch the NewsHour, et cetera, and so forth. Millions of people out there are getting their news from other organizations and other. How do are any of these new platforms reaching those people, Sarah?
One thing I find really interesting is that apparently local news has significantly more trust from its readership than the big national news outlets. And so what I think is really alarming is that the people who are, the institutions journalistically that are suffering the most from the financial shifts in our field really are a lot of the local news outlets, both the local news and also the foreign correspondents, the foreign bureaus that have also been massively stripped of resources. So I think that's where you're seeing some of that. And can you remind me, what was the full question?
I was just wondering if these new platforms and these new forms, some associated with social media, some just new ways to raise money and do this sort of, are reaching into the people who don't read the New York Times and don't read the Washington Post, et cetera, and so forth, who are consistently voting more conservatively.
I think this is a really huge issue. I think we're more and more segmented in our reading tendencies than we've ever been before. Again, partly because of this platform issue we discussed, where algorithmically you're more likely to see the things that you are likely to like to consume. And thus, I think we're becoming very personalized in the kinds of news we're even exposed to begin with. And I think social media can create these echo chambers. It can also do the opposite. I think one of the things I really like about Twitter is that things will enter into my newsfeed that are totally outside my orbit. So I'm able to read like a story in a local Gambian newspaper about the things that the prior dictator was doing to gay and lesbian people who are being put in prison, or I'm able to read far outside of my orbit. But I think the question you're asking is really, really fundamental to the crux of the problem. I've seen this very, very much so on issues of immigration, which I report on a lot, because it's such a deeply polarizing topic, and I think people tend to read the things that affirm their own views on it. And I would love to think about some creative strategies for how we can break outside of that echo chamber. I'm curious your thoughts on this as well, because I'm a bit at a dead end on my thinking on that.
I think you've asked another question too, and that is what's the health of local and regional newspapers and news outlets? And I think it varies tremendously. It varies about the economics, it varies with the ingenuity of people. I was at Notre Dame not too long ago, and I had a chance, I was there for a couple of days on campus, and I had a chance to talk with the editors at the South Bend newspaper. And they really have changed their whole news coverage. They used to try to take some wire coverage of national news, and they used to try to get international news and so forth, and they've given that up. They do a quick news summary somewhere off on part of the front page, and they're really devoting themselves to regional and local news. And they feel as though, and they have to do a combination of print and online, and my recollection is they've gone down to print 5 days a week instead of 7 days a week. But they feel as though they're doing as good a job, and I saw some of the local coverage. I didn't happen to be there at the time that the Medicaid issue was a big issue, but I feel sure from what I saw they would be covering that. There were stories about poverty, there were stories about foreign kids in the schools, there were stories about health care in the South Bend paper. But there are other communities where that just isn't happening.
Are they an independent newspaper, or are they chain-owned?
No, they're an independent newspaper.
Does that make a difference?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. The chances are, if they're a chain, they're picking up a lot of stuff from the national. I write some op-eds for the McClatchy newspaper system. It's the Sacramento Bee, the Miami Herald, Fort Worth Telegram Star, that kind of stuff. And they feed quite a bit of national news. But, I mean, the Miami Herald is an extremely strong, local newspaper covering particularly Latino news, but other news in the Miami area. So, I mean, I would think they'd be strong. Some of the other papers, I really couldn't say. I don't know enough. I mean, it's just, I travel quite a bit, so I see some papers up close. Amherst, Massachusetts, there's a pretty good paper up there. I saw that in Northampton, Massachusetts, whatnot. So it varies from one place to another. The Concord Monitor, I was up in Concord, New Hampshire. Terrific paper, real focus on state politics, state news, pretty good coverage of political reform issues, not just politics. A lot of these, and then I was out in Colorado, and people are complaining crazily about the Denver Post, that its coverage of politics is totally superficial. They miss the Rocky Mountain News. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it's not a consistent story.
No end to the examples, that's for sure, of papers that are doing it well and many that are not, unfortunately. You started mentioning about ownership and
well, I was actually thinking about all the other forms of storytelling people are consuming now, which I think is also a really, really positive trend. So you're seeing like this proliferation of podcasting. I think you're seeing a lot of things that would have once been really hard to find, documentaries that most people wouldn't even have access to. Now you're seeing on Netflix, people are actually able to watch things that they sat down to watch as entertainment, but then lure them into really serious and substantive social issues. So I'm just curious in the audience, like how many people have listened to a podcast, for instance? So I think it's actually really stunning that some of the journalism I find most interesting in the present moment is actually coming out of that space, which I would never have known this if you told me that even just 2 years ago. But when I look at my journalism school students at Columbia, that's actually what they want to be producing. They want to have a podcast, or they want to be doing some kind of multimedia journalism. So I think that's a really hard
Who's paying for it? I mean, presumably that some of these people are working.
In which there is actually a more savvy advertising infrastructure, because apparently, I mean, I'm not sure how the whole business model works, but I know a number of people who have relatively profitable podcasts, and they get advertisers who apparently get a more loyal and dedicated listenership than they would get advertising on a news website. So I'm not sure why it works, but apparently it does work.
There's also a lot of new forms of ownership that we're seeing out there now that include such things as non-government organizations. News teams from rivals are working together. This Panama Papers thing the other day, it apparently brought down the Prime Minister of Pakistan the other day, this reporting thing. So there's new ways to do news that maybe some of these papers you're mentioning are doing that.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting, I wonder whether or not, it'd be interesting, I hope maybe in the question and answer session this comes up, whether or not people are starting to see that maybe important news is a public utility. What we're seeing, I work with Frontline. Frontline now has an outpost at the University of California Journalism School. It has a link up with Boston University. It has one with American University in Washington, D.C. And what they do is you've got journalism students who are studying and working with producers and reporters and editors. You've got the university paying for some of the overhead, that is the rent and the light and the facilities, and some of the equipment, which is very expensive for independent journalists to come up with, and the journalists and Frontline are paying for the production of the project. So the journalism school is getting a center of education and training, and a Frontline operation, and there are other organizations doing it as well. They're getting some of their heavy overhead costs that are hard to bear, they're getting them paid for. So this partnership of nonprofits, and my question is whether or not universities, libraries, nonprofit organizations are going to wind up by seeing that this is a good way, and then you start with the broadcast, but then you get podcasts coming off it, you get something going to Snapchat. I mean, there are now multiple ways of using the material once you've produced it. And maybe more people will get in on both the ownership, the support, the advertising, the dissemination. Yeah. And I think that's part of what's going on in journalism now, is this experimentation to try to find new business models and new distribution models to support the production, because it's the production that costs the money.
Sarah, where are the young students that you're working with at Columbia? Where do they hope to work, and what do they see as the future? Is it this type of thing?
And do they want to go into journalism? Do young people today want to go into journalism?
You know what I find really fascinating? I wasn't really aware of this until the last several weeks. A few of my journalism school students mentioned that they were getting recruited to basically produce native advertising. So are people familiar with that term? So essentially,
No.
forms of ads that are structured to look like real journalism, that are, you're flipping through a magazine and you think you're coming across a book review, but actually it's an ad for a book that looks as if it was reported by a journalist, when in fact it was reported by someone who's paid by an advertising company. So that's a little alarming, but
We're getting a little close to alternative facts here.
Exactly. We're talking about the fake news, right? They do have some outlets that they tend to veer towards. Many of them are the newer online outlets, places like BuzzFeed, which, oftentimes we think of BuzzFeed and we think of like goofy cat videos, but they are producing some incredibly substantive investigative reporting. They love Vox.com, which is sort of explainer journalism, and there's a few other online outlets like Vice is very popular. And so is this increasingly collaborative mindset. I think that they are being raised to think about journalism as a collective process. So for instance, at Columbia, one of the things I'm doing is running something called the Global Migration Program, and part of it is really structured around figuring out innovative and collaborative ways to actually tackle reporting on immigration and the refugee crisis overseas, which is so enormous. How do we even begin to think about sustaining attention on that? And then also looking at Trump-era immigration enforcement here in the US. And one of the things we did this last term was actually we had a mini newsroom, essentially, of 17 students, and we assigned each of them a cluster of states and a cluster of issues. And then I said, every week I want you to be entering into this database everything you can find of all local enforcement activity. So if someone had Washington State and they saw a little local news clip in the Sounder about someone who maybe got apprehended in some kind of immigration enforcement activity, they would put it into the database. And we wound up with this really big database of cases of immigration enforcement that was far beyond what any one individual journalist could have done to get a granular read on what's happening right now. So that's just one small example of how we're thinking about producing collaborative news. But I think there's a lot more, and a lot more impressive, like the Panama Papers that have been going on.
I got a question about younger people. My experience was that the Vietnam War and Watergate were a shot in the arm to American journalism. It just took off.
Yeah, no question.
The war itself was a challenge, the whole question of dealing with the military, whether the government was lying to us, the whole thing. And then Watergate comes along. And everybody, all kinds of people wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. It kind of went, it went overboard. I mean, everybody had to be, I'm going to bring down a president kind of. But there was a resurgence. It's almost as if in politics, as in physics, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So that the corruption, the war, and a president who lied and eventually was forced out of office just generated this strong resurgence in journalism. And my sense is that that is happening again here as a result of the campaign of 2016 and the whole battle over what we're talking about here, fake news, alternative facts, the president attacking the media, all that kind of stuff. I just wondered, has that affected the younger generation? What's going on? Do young people want to be the equivalent of Woodstein today, or what is it?
Yeah, they want to be David Fahrenthold or Maggie Haberman or one of those folks who's actually on the Trump beat. Absolutely. I mean, I can definitely feel that energy at Columbia. People are so riled up, and in a way, the kind of glamour of investigative journalism has come back a little bit, because I think part of the problem with the job is it's not terribly lucrative, and you work a lot, and it could be a very isolating profession. And so I think it's been very helpful to see, I mean, even just the turnout tonight, so many people really, really care about this set of questions. So not only do you see this professional resurgence, but I think you also see a societal resurgence of the recognition of the fundamental role the press plays in a healthy democracy. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but I hope
that's what he said at the outset.
Yeah.
Well, that's encouraging. I guess one of the other encouragements that I get out of this is that there's a lot more value in these other platforms than maybe some of the people in my generation considered. Is that I come up with that hit at least?
I hope so. I mean, because I would differ a little bit in the sense of what you were saying earlier in regard to, certainly it's incredibly important that we have well-trained, highly professional journalists who are doing some of this really difficult work. But I think there's also a lot of space for people who have a deep knowledge in a given field, who now can use the internet to put forward either documents they've got from a local scandal that's bothering them, or just to share expertise. Like I know, for instance, when I went to Iraq for the first time, there was a blog that I followed very closely, and it was called Miss Sparky, and it was a woman who had been a private contractor on a U.S. military base in Iraq, and then she had just kept a blog where she followed every little in and out of Blackwater and a lot of the private military contractor scandals. And I thought it was really heartening to see that if you have expertise, and now you have these platforms in which you can share it, you can actually make a substantive contribution to the collective conversation. So I think that's one way in which that, again, going back to the democratization of media production, I think that's been a very healthy trend.
One of the things that's bothered me a lot about the political climate that we're in right now, which of course involves the news media, is the level of discourse. We're hearing the stuff. This fellow Scaramucci is apparently in a conversation with with your colleagues at the New Yorker, said things that would make the Clinton era, I mean, the little stained purple dress is passé now. It's rough talk. It's a level of discourse that most of us would not entertain in our dining room. Do you see that the news media is being sucked into carrying stuff that lowers the discourse of the entire political process?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the political dialogue in America today is a hell of a lot more coarse than it was certainly 10, 15 years ago, but maybe even just 5 years ago. I think things are being said in public today routinely that have sort of obliterated the idea of shock. I mean, there was Tennessee Williams did Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and when Barbara Bel Geddes came out in a negligee, it was supposed shocking. I mean, if somebody's not nude and turned upside down on the stage today, it's not shocking, right? Well, we've got the equivalent of that going on, in politics. There is no shock level left, and what's happened is then people are just throwing mud or something worse at each other. And I think that's just generic. It's gone way beyond the media. And my own personal experience of it is it's much worse in the social media than it is in the media. And I don't know how we get back to greater civility. But I'm going to say something that may not make sense right off the bat. But I think the coarseness and the lack of civility comes from the hyper-partisanship, the tribalistic feelings that have grown. And it's our side and the other side. And if you start reading the opinion polls and see what people who identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats think of people who identify themselves as the opposite party, what they have to say about the other folks and how they really don't believe in democracy anymore, and how they don't support our system, and how they're treasonous or not loyal to it. I mean, it's outrageous what people say about each other and think about each other. And then I'm going to go a step further and say something that may not make sense to people. I really believe a lot of that has to do with gerrymandering. Our political districts are so gerrymandered. I know it feels like a stretch, but our political districts are so gerrymandered now that 85 to 90% of the seats in the House are predetermined. People know that. If you're an independent or you're a member of the opposite party, there's practically no reason for you to go vote. If you're smart, it's even a rational decision not to vote. The people who run and the people who run the campaigns and the people who fund the campaigns and the people who design the political ads are pushing the envelope as far as they can to the extreme. And we wind up by having two extreme parties, but particularly on one side, but there's more extremism. There used to be an overlap between the parties. And there used to be a need and a desire to trade and deal across party lines. And now there's almost none of that.
You can't run on that platform any longer.
That's right. Well, but that may not seem connected with the coarseness.
Yeah.
But it is. I mean, I remember Birch Bayh, when he resigned from the Senate, said that when he grew up as a kid and his Evan Bayh, resigned from the Senate, he remembered his father, Birch Bayh. And every weekend at their home, they would have Democrats, Southern Democrats, who were very different from Indiana Democrats like Birch Bayh, all right? Richard Russell and company, segregationists from the South, and Republicans into their home. And when they went to the Congress, they dealt with each other as friends. I remember not long ago, a senator commented, "There's nobody in the Senate dining room anymore." Now, that may not seem relevant to public discourse, but it is. Because if you know the people on the other side, if they're human beings whom you value and trust, you may disagree with them. You may even fight with them. You may even have an argument and say, "I'm not going to talk to that SOB again," but in fact you do. And if you don't know them, and you only live with your own kind, and you constantly go to a tribal rally whenever you go to talk to politics, on the 19th green or in the Senate or wherever, then you start to insult the other side in a way in which you can never talk to them again. And then it becomes part of the coarsening of the public discourse, and you can't get back to it. So in many ways, I think we have to get back to fixing our elections so that there's actually a need for politicians to appeal across party lines, to reach out to the middle. And when you have to start to do that, you have to start to deal with people in a nicer way. You can't imagine somebody running a grocery store or a bakery or any kind of a business not wanting to deal with clients of any political stripe in a nice way. Well, in politics, we've lost that. In our public discourse, we've lost that. I don't think the nature of the discourse is disconnected with the dysfunction in our political system. I know that's a long way around, but I think it's fundamental.
I certainly have to agree that we need to begin to wrap up things here, and I want to give each of you maybe a minute or so to kind of wrap things up and see where we are.
Don't we need to get them involved first?
We'll have questions after. Yeah.
I can just springboard off of what you just said, because I really, really appreciate that. Those are all really important points. And I think one of the biggest shocks for me in watching how all of this plays out at the very local level is just seeing the relationship between the commander-in-chief's coarse discourse and seeing how that affects some of the kids that I'm interviewing while reporting. Because I was recently, right around the time of the election, I was in Oklahoma writing about some of the young people who've gotten involved in the Dreamer movement, the DACA kids, who are undocumented and very, very afraid in this current climate. And a number of them told me that their little brothers and their little sisters were going to school, and kids were chanting, like, "Build a wall, build a wall, build a wall," on the morning of the election. And we're chanting, like, we're saying to the kids, "I'm really happy that you're going to have to pack your suitcases and go back." And the little girl had turned to the sister who I was interviewing and said, "You know, are men allowed to grope me? And I'm afraid to go out because are men allowed to grope me?" after the comments about Trump's groping women. So I think one of the interesting things for me has been learning just how much the things that you think don't actually trickle all the way down, whether it be, you know, the comments from a president or the way that the media is covering those comments, really have these profound psychological ramifications for people in every corner of this country. So I think that only ups the responsibility to think about how we turn that language around.
How does the media deal with that? Are there, you know, there used to be words that you didn't see in the New York Times or in other local newspapers, et cetera, and so forth. I doubt anyone would suggest kind of a censorship type thing, but how do we deal with the coarseness that all of us realize is changing our social dialogue, et cetera? Does the media have a role in that?
I wonder if some of it might come from actual investigative projects that illuminate that connection. So I can give you one great example from, you mentioned ProPublica and the real tremendous value of nonprofit journalism in this current landscape. And one of the projects they've been doing is trying to document hate crimes and hate speech. And they have this massive, they're basically trying to use the tools that epidemiologists have used for a long time to study the spread of a virus and to use that in the realm of discourse and to show how these things that are happening at the high level in terms of our shift in discourse are actually resulting in concrete impacts on the ground when it comes to seeing actual hate crimes, or in some cases, the beating to death of, for instance, an immigrant in, I believe it was Kansas, not too long ago, and they've created a massive database where they're actually logging those incidents. So that's just one very small example of the type of investigative work that might make that link. But I'm curious if you have insights on the actual day-to-day coverage. How do we not end up recirculating the very kind of sensational language we're trying to critique? I don't think I have a great answer for that one. Do you?
Well, I thought I'd wrapped up before, but on this score, I don't have a journalism story. But one of the places I've traveled to not too long ago is Tallahassee, Florida. And they were concerned about the civility question and the ability of people to have a dialogue, constructive dialogue, with disagreement without being disagreeable. And a bunch of people, this is just after Jeb Bush left being governor, and several of his cabinet members, obviously high-ranking Florida establishment Republicans, got together with some Democrats from Leon County, which is the county that surrounds Tallahassee, and it being a state capital and a university town is a very Democratic area. And they decided to form an organization called the Village Square. And the whole idea of the Village Square was to actually bring together people of different viewpoints to sit down once a month and talk about some local issue. It could be it could be a problem with the beaches, it could be a problem with after-school programs, it could be a highway transportation, it could be anything. But the whole idea was to start opening dialogues across party lines. That organization started, I don't know, I can't remember how long it's been since Jeb Bush has been out, but he's been out certainly 8-10 years. That organization is still going. They have a dinner meeting every month. I spoke at one of those meetings, and there were 250 people there doing what you all are doing here tonight, but having dinner. And the whole idea was to bring people together. I'm not sure that journalism alone can do this. I think communities have got to decide. And these were not people who necessarily agreed on all the issues. In some issues, they decided to make a project, and they actually tried to enact some legislation to get policy done. Others they couldn't resolve, and they decided to just keep talking. But the point was they were committed to coming together, to talking, regardless of their partisanship. And I think, and back to what I was saying before, I think that reduces the level of the coarseness. It leaves you with the relations. You bump into people later on in the day, you see them next week, you talk to them, and when these things come up, you're still talking about it. You may still disagree, but you're talking in very different tone of voice and in a very different way.
Seems
and
like
I think the best thing we can do in the media is to find examples of where that's happening and seeing where that actually works. Where the mediation notion as opposed to intellectual combat notion.
And some of that can be done on media.
Right. And the media can host some of that. Yeah. I think that's, yeah. And I think there are some news organizations that have gotten behind that. But it's not just a question of reporting. I think it's more than that.
The key, it seems to me, is also that you can do on local issues what you can't do on national issues. And people can get together and talk about things that affect their neighborhoods, their communities, and maybe you still can't make the bridge on big national issues.
But if you build it up over time, and the members of your congressional delegation on each party learn to talk to each other about common problems in their state and in their region, you build it. You build it from the bottom up. It's been destroyed from the top down. Maybe we have to build it back from the bottom up.
Okay, thank you. I learned a lot, and I hope that everyone enjoyed the dialogue. Michael will have the microphone here to take to people who would like to ask a question.
I think we've got about 20 minutes or 25 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there are lots of them, so why don't we begin right here?
I'd like to have you address a topic that hasn't come up yet tonight. The problem of false equivalence, by which I mean false equivalence, by which I mean journalism's traditional stance with respect to the separation of news reporting from opinion is to present both sides of an issue in an objective manner. And many sources are still trying to do this. NPR is a great example. They'll have a spokesman for one side and a spokesman for the other. Often it'll be, for example, someone from the New York Times reporting one position and someone, say, from Breitbart on the other. And the audience tends to hear this as, well, there's side A and then there's side B, and it's up to us to decide between them. But one side is presenting factual information and the other side is presenting made-up stuff. How do journalists deal with the problem of trying to maintain a position of being, I hate to say it, fair and balanced, objective as far as the two sides?
Can we pick it up? We got the idea. Okay, can we pick it up?
Please.
Okay. All right, let me go back. Let me give you a specific example in response to that. If you recall, this is quite a while ago when there was an argument about whether or not Obamacare had death panels. And if you remember, Sarah Palin said there were death panels in the legislation, and the Democrats said there weren't. The way a good journalist deals with that is you get Sarah Palin in there and you let her say what she has to say, and you get the other side and let her have to say. And then you said to Ms. Palin, can you give me the paragraph and the sentence where it's in there? Our job in the end is to be umpires and to blow the whistle when somebody has hit a foul ball. If you're talking about opinions about is this policy a good policy or that a good policy, then it seems to me you do have differing opinions. If somebody starts throwing off false facts, then the job of the moderator or whoever's running the program is to say, just a minute, sir, you just made this statement. It's not just the other side that's saying this. I'm saying this as a journalist. What's the score? I think one of the ways in which journalism has dealt with this institutionally is to begin the process of fact-checking. If you recall, it comes out of political campaigns. The fact-checker says, is this ad honest? Is this campaign statement honest? And so forth. And the good thing, I think, that's happened in a lot of good journalistic organizations is they've continued the practice. That's how we do it. We blow the whistle. I agree with you. What you were talking about, I call ping-pong journalism. You just hit the ping pong ball back to the other side. I don't think that's adequate. And there are some instances where either it is doubtful what the facts are, or there's a difference of opinion about opinion, and in that case we have an obligation to present them both. But when there's a factual situation that we as journalists can check out, then we as journalists need to check it out and blow the whistle and say, I'm sorry, that side is not factual. That's not what's going on. I agree with you, but that's what we need to do.
I think you answered that perfectly. I'm in total agreement on that. I think one thing that's very heartening is that this is, I think, where you see a shift in how young people conceptualize the journalist's ethical obligations, because I think we are shifting away from that old school landscape where there was a construct of objectivity, where we believed in the idea that there was such a thing as a journalist who had no investment in any of this and was just purely reporting the facts. I think we're veering more towards a climate of transparency, an ethos of transparency about how you came to believe the things that you believe. And I think that's a really important part for me of the journalistic process, is not necessarily trying to appear that I'm totally disinvested in the outcome of, say, the idea that the US military is trafficking people onto its bases, but rather letting people know where I'm coming from and how I drew the conclusions that I drew, which does definitely involve trying to understand all the major players who got us to where we are. So I do think it is a moment where it's very, very important to continue to try to privilege fairness and try to privilege actually listening to the side of someone who I may think I can instantaneously dismiss as full of shit, but but at the end of the day, oftentimes when you show up and do the door knocking, this is what shoe leather journalism is about, is you show up and you ask and try to understand where someone's coming from, and sometimes you actually do end up illuminating part of the problem that you wouldn't have otherwise come to understand. So I completely agree, though, that it's not our job to give equal airtime to views that are, on the one hand, factually accurate, and on the other hand, totally inaccurate and help to spew things that are false. So I'm in 100% agreement on that. It's a great question.
Thank you very much. Along those lines, my big issue has been climate change for the last 17 years. And so that false equivalent thing has been a real problem around climate change. But going back even to 2001, 2002, and as the drumbeats for war were getting louder and louder, I was very frustrated with the mainstream media being part of that beating the drumbeat. So this is going way back now, and I'd like to know, how can we depend on the media when there's been so much media consolidation since the 90s? And we really need this coverage to say, we need to have pushback against the rush to war. We've seen what the results of that are now, so I'd like you to speak to that. Thank you.
I'll answer, but I give it back to you. I think actually this is where Sarah has been really enlightening, and that is all the different new sources in the media. I mean, you've got all kinds of academicians who have their own websites. You've got different groups that have their own websites and their blogs. You have the podcast. I mean, this is an arena, and that's a particular issue, where there's lots of other news coming out that's putting pressure on the mainstream media. I'm not an expert in this field, but I don't feel as though I don't know that there's a really serious problem out there and get a fair amount of evidence about it from the mainstream media. I may just not fully understand it, but if there is a problem, there's certainly lots of other outlets, and Sarah knows much more about them than I do.
No, I do think that part of accountability journalism needs to also be holding other journalists accountable. So I wonder if that might, I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but I wonder if that might be a piece of the puzzle when it comes to the drumbeat to going to war in Iraq, for instance. We saw so many pundits who told us there definitely were WMD, gave us a million reasons why we needed to do this, and then went on to have continue to have illustrious journalistic careers. And it does seem like having accountability within the field should be an important thing. And I was a freshman in college when the war began, and that's what drew me into journalism. So I do think a lot of people were really troubled by what they saw of the reporting there and went into the field precisely because they want to be a part of the actual accountability side of the journalistic ecosystem. But I do think one sliver of that has to be thinking critically about our own industry. And so I do worry a little that I just saw some news that some of the what are they called? The individuals who are actually at the journalism institution itself that are meant to be critical of the public editor. The public editor jobs are going down the tubes as well, and I think that's a kind of troubling trend.
Please react to what I understand is happening with ownership. Mid-market television is being bought up for the very, very conservative bent to it, to where the talking points, they'll show one town and another, and the talking points are all the same, and the same with the ownership in mid-city populations for newsprint.
Yes, I think I could handle that one. The thing that we're concerned about here, I think, in the Northwest, is they're buying up a couple local stations. I think Como in Seattle is one of them. What they're doing, among other things, is requiring local stations to carry a spokesman, basically, from their national headquarters who does editorial views, basically, and they're required to put them on a certain number of times a day, whether it makes has any real connection to the local community. I spent 17 years as a commentator on the King Broadcasting System in the Portland station, and others were the equivalent of Charlie Royer and Jim Compton in Seattle, if many of you have watched. And in every case, when we did commentary, it was being done by people who lived in the community, who knew the community, who worked in the newsroom and understood the area where they were working. This guy parachutes in via tape and is presented as a commentary and editorial opinion that the people locally ought to be listening to. Along with that comes a group that has tried to cut deals with the Trump people on we do this for you and you do that for me during the primaries last year. I'm very concerned in terms of ownership that particularly in cable and local television news that we're seeing a consolidation that is very, very troubling to me. When I was working in the business in the 70s and 80s, every one of the local television stations in both Portland and Seattle were owned within the region by local families. None of them now are. And it really makes a difference. Turn on your tube today, those of you who are a little older and remember the way it used to be. I'm also worried about this happening on the newspaper side. And we've already seen some of this. The reason I asked Rick earlier about the paper was whether it was owned independently or owned by a chain. Chain newspapers are good for a few good newspapers at the top of the chain. The bottom feeders feed the top guys. Bellingham is a news desert. And it's because of the same chain that also produces some of the best journalism at the top, the McClatchy organization. And this is a very troubling thing, and I would like to see a revolution in ownership in both local newspapers and in local television. It is very troubling that it's become consolidated the way it is.
I think from your question, the problem's even more insidious than Floyd said. There's not only dictation, I think this is Sinclair Broadcasting,
Yeah.
not only dictation of carrying editorial coverage, but there are news packages that are put out, and there are also news bands that are put out. This gets us back to something very fundamental. In 1987, the Fairness Doctrine was abolished by the Federal Communications Commission. Prior to that, there was a requirement in order to get your broadcast license, if you had a station, that if you broadcast a liberal, then you had to broadcast a conservative. If you had a program that had discussion, you had to have people on the other side. And actually, the problem is even greater with talk radio. So the loss of the Fairness Doctrine was a tremendous change. When you were talking about it, you were talking about the early 80s, and you're talking about since then. The real knife edge was the destruction of the Fairness Doctrine. So we need to get back to some kind of Fairness Doctrine. That's number one. Number two, much more difficult. It's a little hard to figure out how you would frame a law that would somehow limit the ability of single owners to own 2,000 outlets across the country and broadcast basically the same slant on the news.
We used to have laws like that operated by the FCC. They controlled it.
Well, you got better memory than I do then. Maybe we did, but it's, in any case, if we did, then we need to get back to them. If we didn't, we need to fashion them, because I think this is a very dangerous trend. And the part of the difficulty is it's another way in which wealth is affecting the public dialogue. It's not just campaign donations, but it's the ability to buy up and control media, and particularly if you can do it across the country. In 15 or 20 or 30 states, you start to have a major influence on political attitudes, on social attitudes that have very wide effects. So the question you've raised is a really difficult and important question. I don't have an answer to it, but I agree with you, we need to worry about it.
There was a time when broadcast, in particular, was regarded and regulated as a public utility rather than just simply a way to make money. And that is possible to return to.
So I'm glad that all this talk about money came up just before I was going to say something, because just to point, to bring up that the news industry doesn't occur in a bubble. And when you were beginning to talk just for a little while, Sarah, about the algorithms that have people be in a news bubble or a media bubble, the missing piece here might be that actually the income stream works the same way. That you have the clicks, all of the advertising dollars are allocated by algorithm. So the money is available in some cases for some of these new podcasts, news outlets. So the question of can, let's say, someone go from the Columbia School of Journalism to making $1 million a year on their blog? The answer would be yes. And likewise, the influence of money coming through algorithms rather than through just this kind of top-down thing that you're talking about right now, I think has to bring us to a question of, it's awfully broad, I'm really sorry, but ethics in society and values in society and where those come from. Because it's not just within the news media. Once the algorithms are in effect, they are, controlling both the news aspect, but also the income stream.
Michael, you got a new topic.
Well, I do think it's not entirely new in the sense that it's totally woven into the earlier question we were having about the platforms through which people are reading this stuff and how the actual funding takes place, right? So I didn't know much about this at all until sitting in at Columbia. We have something called the Tao Center where they're explicitly studying this dimension. How do you actually monetize these stories? And the trouble is all of the money is flowing into the platforms that are sharing the reported journalism and not going to the outlets that are actually the ones paying for the production of the news. And so I know that doesn't get to the much grander question about how do we instill ethics in all of us, which hopefully we can stay around for coffee afterwards and tackle that one. But I think the starting point really is this question of monetization of the news and how are we going to deal and reckon with the fact that the platforms are the ones now garnering the money from the institutions that actually paid to produce the very expensive journalism.
A question over here?
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I do a lot of keyword searches on Google because I'm very interested in just transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm very grateful to Floyd McKay for his reporting on the proposed coal terminal at Cherry Point. So when I do a search practically every day on oil and coal, I then click on news as opposed to looking at all or everything. And there is a lot of good news there. And when I find a good article, and it's an outlet I haven't subscribed to, I often subscribe just because I do want to encourage good journalism.
Thank you.
So that's my strategy.
I think that's great. I do think actually subscriptions we have seen a tremendous, people are calling it the Trump bump, the massive, massive flood of subscriptions. I think the New Yorker got like 10 times the subscriptions we normally have. Like in the month of January alone, we just saw a 300% increase in our subscribers. That was the correct number. So I know the New York Times got even more. So I think, thank you for doing that. And I hope all of us are subscribing to the outlets and being willing to pay for the reporting that we value.
There appears to be a bump in local newspapers also. I think Seattle Times is doing better during this period, among others. And what that means to me is that people are becoming aware of the need to be aware that things are going on that they really need to know about. And it drives an interest in helping pay for local media. And I would guess that you're probably seeing it also in public broadcasting and public radio.
I think we can take one more question. Let's see. Cindy.
I was really interested in your dialogue about vulgar language and the idea of elevating the discourse that was going on. And it seemed like there might be, for me, I had a cognitive problem with what was going on because vulgar language in this last campaign certainly has been used as a tool to signify populism and to signify authenticity. And I think that the pussy grabbing incident is a really good example of that. The reason that he got off for that terrible display of misogyny was because people asked themselves, really, is that the way people talk in locker rooms? And they came up with the answer, yes. And I think that much like what's happening, and I would like to hear from you if you think that it's a valid idea, that much like what is happening is that the fake news is distracting from what's really going on. This dialogue over whether or not we should have shocking language or cursing is distracting from really the substance of what's happening and what is being done to people right now, and whether we need to just forget about the whole shocking language thing and look at what is actually going on and being said.
Yes. Yeah, I think you hit 2 or 3 really important points. One is there is clearly a distraction strategy going on. There's a shock and disperse element. I don't want to get into rating the president, but I don't think the president is as foolish about his use of Twitter as a lot of people do. That doesn't mean I don't think there's some outrageous and foolish things that he's said, but he is doing partly what you're talking about. He is distracting, he's running a show, and he's found that that both activates and encourages and maintains his link with his base, and it does distract the opposition. Secondly, as you were talking, I was thinking back about that episode on the bus in Hollywood, and he got off and so forth. So what do we do with that as a press? Well, we had to cover it, and I think we were right to cover it. People had a right to know this is the way a candidate for the President of the United States thought about women, spoke about women, and dealt with women. What the public made of it is not the responsibility of the press. That's why I said at the very beginning, you're part of the equation. We put stuff out there, and it's up to then the other us, the people, to decide what we want to do about it. So I think we need to continue our exposure of the crudeness of anybody in public life. I don't want to focus on just one individual. On the other hand, we have to be very careful that we don't become so fascinated with that we, as a media, get distracted from the business of the coverage we should do. And actually, I think that the press has done a pretty good job. I mean, think of what you know about the behavior of Michael Flynn and Sessions and the chairman of his campaign and Jared Kushner and Donald. I mean, think all the things that you know. Think you wouldn't know that if there weren't enterprise reporting. I like the word enterprise rather than just investigative. It isn't just investigating. It is having the enterprise to ask the questions beyond the questions. I don't know if you saw the story in the New York Times the other day. It's a really interesting story buried in the paper. That Kenneth Starr, when he was the special prosecutor, the special counsel for Bill Clinton, actually wrote a memo, which is in the archives, the National Archives, that said that Kenneth Starr believed the president could be indicted for a crime. That's interesting. That's a Republican-appointed independent prosecutor saying a president, a Democratic president at that time. But the New York Times had the smarts, somebody at the paper did, had the smarts to ask the question, to go to the National Archives, to see Kenneth Starr's files, to file a Freedom of Information Act request, to pursue it. Do you have any idea how many months went into doing this? We now have a question. People have started talking. Is this guy, can he pardon himself? Can he pardon his family? Can we indict a president? Here's a Republican prosecutor's answer, written over a decade ago. So you can't say there's a partisan answer. That's the kind of journalism that's going on. And if that stuff goes on, as I go back to this business, when you go to a doctor, when you go to a lawyer, when you go to a really good automaker, you're looking for somebody with a range of experience that's going to bring that experience and that judgment to bear. And I agree completely with what Sarah said about all the new avenues we have. I mean, the people who had the photos and the people who had the information coming out of Syria and out of Cairo and out of, Ohio and Oklahoma and Minnesota, or the guy who got the photo of the cop shooting the black in South Charleston as he was running the other way and killing him. Those weren't news people, but they had a news instinct and it got into the news media. Those are all important people. But we've got to be smart enough and humane enough to make that combination of judgments so that we're covering the news you need to know. We're telling you something about the coarseness of the language in public debate without glorifying it. So you as a people, we as a people, because we're a part of you too, can make sound judgments about where we go as a society. That's what you're looking for. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're striving for. So the question you ask has got all kinds of rich components to it. Thank you.
Do you have anything to add to that, sir?
Sorry?
Do you have anything to add to that?
I love what you said, and I loved your question. I do have a favorite podcast, Call Your Girlfriend, on which they deal with that problem by just referring to the president as Ivanka's dad or the orange man and refuse to say anything more. So I do think there's times when the right thing to do is to not cover something. And then I think there's times when the right thing to do is exactly what you just described so eloquently, which is to dig in and to be persistent and to keep covering it. And then I think there's also the question for all of us as news consumers. I think many of us are just feeling really, really overwhelmed because there's so many issues that feel deeply urgent, and people have voiced in the audience caring about climate change, and people I know in this audience care about healthcare, and how do you even manage to cover it all? And so some of it for me has also been learning, as a journalist, it's about learning to stay in my lane and really keep my head down on the areas I care about, but also as a reader, I've made that choice to some extent to really try to say criminal justice and the incredible movement towards reforms we were making is very, very important to me. And so I'm going to be a diligent reporter on those issues, but I'm also going to be a diligent reader. And I'm going to seek to curate my own reading so that I'm not just looking at the New York Times and the Washington Post on this, but I'm also looking at some of the outlets I love in Texas that are covering the border. Immigration is another thing I care a lot about. So I'm reading the Texas Monthly, I'm reading the Texas Observer, I'm following journalists over on the other side in Mexico at the border who are covering this stuff rigorously, and I'm really trying to make conscious choices, sometimes to read Breitbart, because I think there are moments when it really helps to try to get a deeper sense of what a diverse array of people are saying, but to not let myself get so overwhelmed that I stop reading the news altogether, because I think there is a very real risk that we're going to exhaust ourselves pretty quickly off this cycle. I mean, how many of us can keep living just checking Twitter 5,000 times a day? So I think we need to make some really conscious choices, certainly as journalists, to really focus on our areas of expertise and not get diverted. And then also I would add to the crass language issue, figuring out what are the moments when we actually have to dig in and study the language, because I would argue some of what you're seeing rhetorically this week with Trump's speeches on immigration and the speech he just gave today, I believe it was today in Long Island, likening certain immigrants to, quote, animals, has profound resonance with some of what we've seen of very racialized dialogues in the past, or forms of political discourse in the past that have led to very concrete violence against other people. So I do think it's important to understand the ways some of this language is actually coded to make racial arguments and ethnic arguments that need to be studied, deconstructed, and pointed to other moments in history that we can learn from in figuring out how we're going to deal with it.
I think that's a good point to end this discussion. We're going to have a book signing out in the lobby. Hedrick is going to be signing copies of his latest book, Who Stole the American Dream. And also Floyd has a book called Reporting the Oregon Story that some of you may be interested in. So why don't we head back there? You can continue our discussion.
Good work, guys.